Welcome in what is the second of our series on the green transition in Europe, with a little bit of focus on its central and Eastern European countries, but not exclusively. So we'll look today at the labor market and social implications of the green transition. And I'm very happy that my colleagues Zeev, Krill, Alex Hijzen, and Cesar Barreto will in a minute present a paper on this issue. And after this, we will have a discussion with a really good group, what I think is a really good group of experts. We have Gonzalo Carlos Caprirolo Caporetti, who's from the Ministry of Labor, Family and Social and Equal Opportunities. Social Affairs and Equal Opportunities in Slovenia. Anna Daimler is joining us from the trade union VIDA in Austria. Markus Jansa is from our partner organization, the Institute of Employment Affairs, IAB, in Nuremberg, here in Germany. And finally, Javier Sanchez Reaza is joining us at what is a very early hour for him, from Washington, from the World Bank, and I'm really looking forward to this debate. But without further ado, Gonzalo, Cesar, I'm sorry, I will now give you the screen and the word, and we are curious to hear what your analysis will show us for the further discussion.
Thanks, Nicola, and hello, everyone. My name is Krill, and I will briefly present the motivation for our joint project with Cesar Barreto and Robert Gunke, which was part of our work on the last economic survey for Germany, published in last May, before letting Cesar present and explain the main results. As some of you might know, Germany has set ambitious climate mitigation targets, basically aiming to triple the speed of the reduction from 1990 and reach net zero before the mid of the century. In our report, we used a macro model. So can you, yeah. In our report, we used a macro model to evaluate the economic impact of the needed climate mitigation efforts. Our simulations suggest that the needed climate policy are likely to have only a minor negative impact on overall or on the aggregate employment, as found in other research on the topic, but they do require a significant reallocation of labor and production from polluting industries to other industries, with possible negative effects for workers and for some communities. In Germany, a significant reduction in employment has already happened. Between 1993 to 2019, the share of employees in the high carbon. So can you please? So as you can see in this slide, the share of employees in the high carbon intensity sectors declined by about a third from 1992. The idea of this project was to take advantage of this significant reduction and to investigate the effect of job loss in Germany, and especially in carbon-intensive industries, to inform policy that could minimize the adjustment cost for the affected employees. We did it by estimating the decline in earnings after displacement, separately for workers displaced from high carbon intensity sectors and low carbon intensity sectors. I will explain how we define the high carbon intensity sectors in a minute. While within each group of employees, we compared or group of sectors, we compared individuals with similar characteristics who were displaced and who weren't displaced before and after a mass layoff event. We defined a mass layoff event as an event with at least 30% employment drop in 1 year among establishment with at least 50 employees, which is a significant downsizing. The last definition before we move forward to the result, we define the carbon-intensive sectors in the economy as those in the top 2 deciles of the carbon intensity distributions. And we found that those sectors cover more than 80% of emissions in Germany since 2000. And the result that Cesar will present in a second stay stable even if we change this definition and we use greenhouse gases instead of carbon emissions. And I will let Cesar to continue from here. Thanks.
Thank you, Zeev. So this is our main result of the analysis. So we find that displaced high carbon intensity workers suffer lasting and significant reduction in earnings. So as you can see here, this is basically plotting the development of earnings relative to the match control in each sector. And the time of displacement is between -1 and 0. And then from 0 on, we start seeing the years after displacement. And we can see is that job loss is very costly for both workers, for both groups of workers, but particularly more so for workers displaced from high carbon intensity sectors. So particularly in the first year, these workers experience about 43% earnings drop compared to 58%, and this gap is persistent over time. And 5 years after displacement, the loss amounts to 5.9 percentage points. So the difference between the two groups amounts to 5.9 percentage points. In the next step, we investigate what drives the earnings losses. So earnings losses could be either because these workers struggle to find a new job or because the daily wages conditional on reemployment are lower. So we find, consistent with the literature, that the employment probability actually recovers over time for both groups of workers, but particularly for the high carbon intensive workers, they experience more drastic losses in daily wages, and these losses are persistent. So these workers actually do not recover, as you can see on the graph on the right-hand side. So for explaining these losses in wages, the literature points to the fact that firms are very important. So that where you get displaced from is very important, and in particularly the loss in so-called establishment-specific wage premiums, which is, you can think of this as a average wage that is paid equally to all employees in a given establishment. And we find that high carbon intensity sectors, they have higher establishment wage premiums, and consequently for these workers at displacement, they experience higher losses of these establishment-specific wage premiums, and this is in turn can explain a lot of the difference in wage losses that we observe in the previous chart. So this is consistent with the sectors having, on average, more stronger bargaining power of workers. So these are sectors that are typically unionized in Germany. And it could also be consistent with the sectors being perhaps more productive. So at this point, we can really disentangle these two explanations. In the next step, we look at job mobility after job displacement for workers in high carbon and low carbon intensity sectors. And on panel A, you can see basically the probability to change occupation, industry, and district after displacement. So what we find is that these high carbon intensity workers are more likely to switch occupations, they're more likely to switch industries, and slightly more likely to change district after displacement. In a separate analysis, we investigate and we find that those that change districts, they experience lower earnings losses as opposed to those that change occupation and industry, and they tend to experience actually higher earnings losses compared to the people that didn't do these changes. And in addition, we find that we use a measure of skill distance. So basically, is a measure ranging from 0 to 1, where 0 implies no distance and 1 implies a high skill distance to the pre-displacement occupation. And we find that at displacement, the high carbon intensity workers, they experience a higher skill distance from the pre-displacement occupation. So they move to occupations that are also more distant in the skill dimension than the workers from the low carbon intensity sectors. In the next step of the analysis, what we do is we try to understand what are the drivers of the difference between sectors. And for this, what you can see here is a Watsaka-Blinder decomposition of earnings losses. So the first bar would represent the earnings loss, which is about 5.9 percentage points after 5 years, as I commented. And we try to explain this by differences in the composition of displaced workers in high carbon and low carbon intensity sectors. So basically by the fact that these workers are different in observable ways, and this accounts for the different effect that we find. So by doing this, we find that 4 things are quite important for difference. So the first one is that workers in high carbon intensity sectors, they're older. So, and this is associated with higher earnings losses. They also get displaced from establishments that have higher wage premium. And they also are more skill remote. And skill remote implies here that the average distance to the available set of occupations in their labor market is higher. So when they get displaced, they experience higher earnings losses because they're kind of more forced to move to more distant occupations. So consistent with the result that we find before. And the next thing that we find is important is that these labor markets are highly concentrated. So basically, this implies that a low number of firms are hiring workers from that particular occupation. So this also increases, is associated with higher earnings losses at displacement. And finally, we try to identify workers that are particularly vulnerable to the prospect of job displacement in high carbon intensity sectors. So for this, we go in 2 steps. So first, we document that earnings losses after displacement are very heterogeneous across worker groups. So this is what you can see in this panel A. So essentially, what you can see here is that, for example, older workers, they experience steeper earnings losses after displacement. Also, relatively uneducated workers without vocational training, women, workers in East Germany in routine jobs, etc. And then what we do is we add an interaction with the high carbon intensity sector. So this graph, this panel B basically shows the interaction with the high carbon intensity sector, and this tells you compared to the baseline estimate, so compared to workers in the low carbon intensity sectors, if these workers experience even worse earnings outcomes if they are being displaced from the high carbon intensity sector. And we find that this is true for some worker groups. So for example, for older workers, age 50 to 55, if they get displaced from the high carbon intensity sector, this is associated with an even stronger or steeper earnings loss. This is also true for workers in vocational training. So this suggests that it could be firm-specific human capital, what is going on. And we also find this for workers in East Germany, which could respond to lower outside options in East Germany compared to the West Germany. So yeah, thank you very much. For more information, please have a look at the economic survey, and I will pass then to Alex.
Okay, thanks a lot. Great to participate in this presentation. So what I will extend is a separate but closely related project that builds on the previous project by extending the analysis essentially to a cross-country setting. It's work that is in preparation for the next edition, the 2024 edition of the Employment Outlook, that will be fully dedicated to the labor market effects of the green transition. So this is very much work in progress, and that means that the results are still preliminary. So The overriding objective of our work is to provide comprehensive cross-country evidence on the cost of job displacement in brown industries. We focus on two questions in particular. The first one is similar to the one in the previous presentation. So does the cost of job displacement in greenhouse gas intensive industries differ from that in other industries, so within countries? And the second question is new. Do the costs of job displacement in greenhouse gas intensive industries differ across countries? We proceed very similarly to the previous presentation. We estimate separately the cost of this job displacement in greenhouse gas intensive industries and other industries. We compare the outcomes of displaced workers with those of non-displaced workers while ensuring that they are comparable, that they look similar in terms of their observable characteristics using matching techniques. So our main finding is that there are large and persistent earnings losses for workers who are displaced from greenhouse gas intensive industries. These are significantly larger than those for displaced workers from other industries. And as in the case for Germany, this is largely driven by wage losses or firm-related wage losses in particular. And the second main finding is that there are significant differences in earnings losses across countries. And this is to a greater extent driven by differences in joblessness than differences in wage losses. So for the present project, we define brown industries in terms of greenhouse gas intensity. So this is slightly different from the previous presentation. So we do this because it's slightly more general and tends to be consistent with the official emission targets that countries have. But as I've indicated, the results are very similar if you do it with CO2 intensity. So we also define greenhouse gas intensity by looking at the frequency with which a particular industry is represented among the most polluting industries in a country. This is reflected by the bars in the charts and provides a natural cutoff. Our measure of greenhouse gas intensity captures about 70 to 80% of emissions in a country. But I think interestingly, it just captures 10% of employment. So these industries are highly concentrated. And I think that's important because that means that to the extent that the green transition will trigger any job losses in the future, we know pretty much we have a good idea in which industries these job losses are concentrated, and consequently trying to document the consequences of job displacement in those industries will be highly informative of the kind of issues that people might be confronted with when displaced in the future as a result of the green transition. So we implement our empirical approach in a fully consistent way in different countries using a harmonized statistical data protocol and applying it to linked employee-employee data. So linked employee-employee data are data that allow following workers across firms. They're typically drawn from administrative systems related to the social security or tax system in a country. This means that they are very comprehensive. They typically cover the universe of workers or firms in a country, or otherwise a very large sample. And the information tends to be of very high quality, notably with respect to wages. So far, we cover 8 OECD countries in our analysis. We hope to extend the country coverage in the next couple of months a little bit further. And we focus on the periods to the extent possible 2019. So we stopped just before the start of the COVID-19 crisis. So let me then turn to the main results. So this slide focuses on the difference in the effects of job displacements in greenhouse gas intensive industries relative to other industries. To keep it simple, we just focus at the effects 5 years after displacement. The results are very much in line with those for Germany. So we find that in all countries, the earnings losses of workers who are displaced from greenhouse gas intensive industries are significantly larger than those who are displaced from other industries, and that this is mainly driven by wage losses rather than differences in the incidence of joblessness. Looking in more detail, decomposing wage losses in a worker-related component related to the loss of firm-specific human capital and firm-related wage losses, we find that the bulk of these wage losses reflects firm-related wage losses, which suggests that the reason why workers experience larger earnings losses is that they were displaced from previously high-paid jobs. So given the importance of wage losses for displaced workers from those industries, an interesting question is to ask whether wage insurance should be part of the toolkit to support displaced workers. So this is a nice question, because wage insurance is arguably the most direct tool that policymakers have to compensate displaced workers for wage losses by effectively topping up their earnings when they find a new job, by giving them a top-up that's proportional to the shortfall in wages, or the difference between their current job and their previous job. Another nice feature of this is that by making employment more better paid, it strengthens job search incentives and may help to bring people back to work more quickly. So wage insurance, so in principle, it sounds nice in the present context, but it has been little used in countries. The country with most experience with wage insurance is the United States, which has long run a program of wage insurance to support trade displaced workers. And a recent evaluation suggests that wage insurance is a very effective tool to support displaced workers, mainly because it reduces the duration of unemployment. So it brings people back to work more quickly. And this reduces the cost of unemployment benefits. It increases tax receipts, and these benefits, these reduction in costs are big enough to actually compensate for the cost of the program. So for the US, the evidence suggests that the program might pay for itself. Germany also has some experience with wage insurance. It used to have a wage insurance scheme for older workers between 2003 and 2011. There have been some evaluation, but the evidence is not so clear, mainly because take-up was very low, which made it difficult to conduct very informative evaluations. We're not entirely decided yet whether we think wage insurance is something that should be used or should be part of the toolkit or not. On the one hand, it can be useful, also it can maybe limit concerns about job loss and as such help to build support, public support for climate change mitigation policies. But on the other hand, it also can raise equity concerns because they're necessarily targeted at high wage workers. And so I think the latter is less of a concern when the program pays for itself, as seems to be the case in the US. It may also be less in a concern if it's part of a broader package, which also includes policies that focus more on low wage workers. Let me then turn to the second main finding of our work so far, and that's to look at the cost of job displacement across countries. So this compares the cost of job displacement in greenhouse gas intensive industries in levels across countries on average during the first 5 years since displacement. And so it shows that there are quite significant differences in the cost of job displacement across countries. So this is shown in panel A, total earnings. The smallest earnings losses are observed for Germany. And in some countries, the earnings losses can be much bigger, up to 2 or almost 3 times as large. And in contrast to the comparison within countries, differences across countries or between countries are to a much greater extent driven by differences in joblessness, although wage losses also play a role. So what explains these cross-country differences in the cost of job displacements? Now this is, and why are the cost of job displacement so much smaller in Germany than in other countries? These are difficult questions to answer, and we don't have firm answers yet. However, there are a few things we can say. We can say that differences across countries are not driven by difference in the composition of workers and firms. Instead, what appears to be important is the efficiency of the labor market in allocating workers to jobs. And one simple way of looking at this is by comparing the earnings losses of job displacement with the average unemployment rate during the same period. So this is done in panel A, and it suggests that in countries with lower average unemployment rates, such as Germany and Austria, the earnings losses of job displacement tend to be smaller. And of course, lower cost of job displacement, lower unemployment rates also likely to be driven to an important extent by differences in policies and institutions, and in particular policies that support workers in making transitions from unemployment to employment. And so to look at that, we look at the share of spending on activation policies as a share of GDP, and relate it again to the cost of job displacement in terms of annual earnings. And this suggests that in countries that invest more in active labor market policies, that spend more on active labor market policies, such as Germany and France, these tend to suffer also smaller earnings losses due to displacement. So this is very much work in progress, but I think these results are already quite suggestive that there is potentially an important role of policies and institutions, and particularly activation policies, in limiting the cost of job displacement across countries. So to conclude, displaced workers from greenhouse gas intensive industries tend to suffer very large and persistent earnings consequences. So clearly there's a need for effective policies to support these workers. These policies are important per se to prevent financial hardship among displaced workers and their families, but also to reduce concerns about concerns of job loss, and as a result build public support for the green transition. So to support displaced workers, a range of policies is needed. We need effective income support systems to support the earnings of workers, of displaced workers during periods of joblessness. We need effective activation and lifelong learning systems to support transitions from unemployment back into work. And we need policies to support workers in regions with strong concentrations of greenhouse gas intensive industries, which may take a combination of place-based policies, so local policies to support displaced workers, and policies that can promote geographical mobility. So this was it for me. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion and any comments you may have.
Yeah, thank you very much, Zeev, Cesar, and Alex. And if you take down the slides now, Cesar, we can enter our discussion. And I think I would like to start with you, Gonzalo Caprirolo from the Slovenian Ministry of Labor. Now, Slovenia was in none of the investigations we've shown today, but first of all, I would like to hear, does that basically sound familiar when you look at the Slovenian labor market? So is it true that, so the results seem to show that workers from carbon intensive, energy intensive, greenhouse gas intensive industries have to lose a lot because they have relatively good jobs, high wage premia, and yeah, and they have to lose more when they are older. So is that the case in Slovenia as well? And in your mind, what's the policy package that you will need as climate policies become more stringent to make sure that these workers can basically, the effect on them can be cushioned and they can continue to contribute to the Slovenian economy? You have to unmute yourself, Mr. Caprirolo.
Okay, thank you very much for the question and for the good presentations, and for inviting to me to this event. So basically, I think I concur with the findings with relatively high earnings in particularly industries that are relatively polluted, particularly in regions who are more unionized, in regions that produce, let's say, are linked to producing of, let's say, coal. Still in Slovenia is the case until 2033. In general, I think it depends pretty much on the industry. I think we should divide in industries that are highly producing coal or on other industries to determine the profile of individuals that can be affected. I don't know. I have looked at some studies regarding European Union, particularly one paper from published at the European Commission, saying that the bulk of individuals that will be hurt are from the age 25 to 49. Old age workers are not much affected. I think what's more important is really to come close to determine what are the industries that will be affected and what to be done. I think probably one way forward is to look at what the industries are or companies are let's say, paying coupons for polluting. So basically, this will be a starting point to determine actually the potential of individuals that can go through this transition. As regard to, let's say, measures that can be done, it's in the case also in Slovenia that we have identified the region of Silesia and Saska, in which actually we know that the jobs will be finalized. In this regard, we have with the Just Transition Fund created two projects that will help to actually mitigate these losses by retraining and enhancing the labor market. Of course, there is need of a comprehensive strategy to try to mitigate, but I think the most important issue is to really to come up with a clear view of the spectrum of individuals that will displace and the extent that will this take place. I think this is very important because there are different estimates, and I think country-specific estimation regarding the transmission of this should take place. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Javier, you have a study on making the EU Green Deal work for people and a human development based exercise in some ways. Perhaps you can tell us something about that, and if you have insights into that, because Mr. Capriolo just confirmed that sometimes specific regions are very much affected. And so the question is here a little bit, can you anticipate? So should workers be already retrained before they might be losing jobs? What's the best approach to make the EU Green Deal work for people?
Thank you, Nicole, and thanks for inviting me. For me, it's a particular pleasure to be with you. My hat has always been at the OECD, so it's nice to be back in a way, even if it's online. We launched the report that you mentioned, the Making the European Green Deal Work for People, back in April at the Commission, and basically at the core of the sort of economic intuition that we put into the report is this series of transitions that start with a policy shock, which is a Green Deal, that will put firms in a decision to change the mix of factors of production. And that's going to lead to technological change at the micro level. At the macro level, that means capital deepening. And yes, we find confirmation using our general equilibrium model that there will be productivity gains stemming from the capital deepening. But that's also coming at the same time with a shift in the skills demand in the labor market. And because the skill supply is rather fixed in the short to medium term, as workers get the signal in the market and factor prices to reskill or upskill themselves, that's going to change sort of factor prices and relative factor prices, and will lead to to imbalances in the labor market. That provided there's factor mobility in the country, that will mean that firms will concentrate in particular places, you know, the Parises and the Berlins and the Londons of the EU, and that will strengthen the sort of agglomeration economies at the local level and will drive even more workers to that particular places, which means draining in some cases skills from less advantageous places or lagging regions. So that presents a view of exacerbated inequalities at the regional level, right? And that's important because that leads in our simulations, that leads to a wage inequality that increases over time. Even if with more stringent policies, we anticipate that those actually start to decline in the longer term towards 2050. The remaining issue is that we are presented with a social conundrum: what to do to face rising inequality across Europe, not only at the sector level but also at the regional level. So that is sort of a taste of what the report does. There's also a section, particularly on job transition pathways, which basically does similar to other papers in the literature. It does try to find what the route that minimizes costs for retraining of workers using occupations at the task level, and try to identify what the short distance, as you guys did, short distances between one particular occupation and another one at the task level, and try to find which are the options for each given occupation. So we do a lot of things within the report. What I really like, I wanted to mention that what I really like about this paper, there's a lot to like about the paper, and I congratulate the team for the high quality of this paper. What I really like is that it departs from the discussion of what is a green job. You know, most people, including myself, we are sort of in this quest of the holy grail of what is a green job, and we all go back to ONET because there's nothing else around yet, right? Or there's a few things, I should say only a few things that are still being tried. And the problem with ONET is that it assumes that there are homogeneous technologies across countries. And working for the World Bank, that presents a particular problem. When you are talking about, you know, Central Asia, you can't assume that there's the same level of technology in Uzbekistan that it is that they exist in the US. So it's nice and refreshing to see another angle to these, trying to look at the actual carbon emissions and try to depart from that point of view. And yes, well, that's basically what I wanted to say. I think that one of the salient features is, and I think it was Cesar that mentioned that, or maybe some of your colleagues as well. There are larger impacts. I think it was implicit in your presentation. There are larger impacts at the local level than anticipated. It's not only the loss of the job, is through value chains, what the impact of the larger regional economy might be. If workers leave, the higher skilled workers leave, then that constrains firms at the local level. It raises reservation wages at the local level, and it creates a series of problems for productivity at the local level. So I anticipate that these are the minimum costs that a region might face, but there are others that are still to be explored. And thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Javier. So we already are in a set of very complicated problems. So perhaps exacerbated regional inequalities. We talked about retraining needs and perhaps wage subsidies. So Anna Daimler, in a country like Austria with strong social partnerships, what can social partners contribute in this transition? Is it possible to anticipate? How realistic is it to train older workers in particular? And perhaps you can also say whether you think this idea of the wage subsidy, whether that the wage, Entgeltsicherung, whether that's something that wage insurance, whether that appeals to you in this context.
Thank you for the invitation. I hope you can hear me clearly. It's a bit loud in my background. Okay, fine. Hello to everybody. There are a lot of questions connected with the fair transition, not just in the industry sector, but mainly at the moment there. Please let us not ignore also other sectors, for instance, the transport sector, which is a main driver in the climate question. But referring to your questions, what can the social partners do? Force politics to act, because what we all need is a clear structure, a clear plan. It's not enough to say we need to reach the 2 degrees goal, but it's also important to say how. And then social partners can work on the concrete actions that have to be done to that point. So that is what I think is missing at the moment. And then we can develop instruments how to do that change for the employers and for the employees. So both sides have to be taken with us in that part. And that's, as I said, very hard if nobody knows what's the plan in fact. For the workers, what we experience in Austria is the missing link in requalification and in transition. In fact, there are more missing links. One is the income. Not even the income after the transition, so being in a new job, but mainly the income in the phase of transition. So what is paid when I'm doing my qualification or my requalification, and we don't have really good measurements or good examples for how people did requalification while they have a job. Why is that? Because the employer where they have the job at the moment usually doesn't want that someone makes a qualification outside of the company where the person is now, because still the person is needed at the company that is where the person is employed now. So that's a challenge that we have to solve. That's a question of income. That's a question of reducing working time gradually over a period of time in order to have time for requalification. It is also a question of mobility, of course. It was also one question that you asked. So what makes it attractive to move oneself either regionally or to another sector? I would say a guaranteed job is very important. So we see within Austria, we have a need for workers, especially in the West, and we have a lot of workers searching for jobs in the East. But even within Austria, it's hard to transfer workers from the East to the West because there are a lot of seasonal jobs. It's not attractive for a seasonal job to move your whole family, your flat, all the things. And there are some legal problems as well. If you have a cheap flat in Vienna, you would not give that up. You would not want to give it up to go for a seasonal job to the West. In fact, you would have to do that because you're moving somewhere else and you have no right, in fact, to keep your cheap flat, especially if it's a flat that is subsidized, so you have a very cheap rent. That is not solved. So if we want people to move, especially regionally, you have to attract the region where they are going. but you also have to solve the private issues that they have with living, right? Kindergarten places and all that stuff. Yeah, we're working hard in Austria to solve all these issues, but we're not at the end. For the qualification of elderly people, there are some quite hopeful examples that make me optimistic that that works out very, very fine. We had that that project Action 55, so for people that are older than 55, offering them public jobs, and a lot of them are still in those public jobs. So that worked out very, very well. We also have what we call the third, outside of the first employment market. Those projects worked out also very well. So 80% are still in that job that they started, and the starting point was always with public money in order to make it attractive also for employers to hire people at that age, because that is the main barrier, at least in Austria. Those people are discriminated on the labor market. If you are 45, in fact, then you can see that the chance to find a new job is really diminishing highly. So that's the main barrier that we have to focus here. But all the projects that we did, especially for that target group, are really, really make me optimistic. I hope I got all your questions. I will have a break.
Sure. And you don't have to answer everything in one go. We take rounds. But thank you, Anna. Yeah, that was very comprehensive. So Markus Jansa of the IAB. Well, first of all, I think you looked into one issue recently that also came out of the paper on Germany, which is that if you have a vocational training, you're endangered a little bit more than if you don't. And I think you found that now vocational training in greener jobs is very popular. So young people somehow seem to anticipate this. But because we were a lot, Anna stressed a lot the mobility aspect, and that's also something that comes out of the German paper. If you are mobile, if you are able to move, then your wage losses, your earnings losses tend to be smaller. But Anna rightly pointed out that that's not easy for everyone, for the young people perhaps, but it can get more complicated. So Markus Borowiecki from the audience asked, so do we need support for mobility, or should we have place-based policies that somehow transform jobs in energy intensive or carbon intensive industries and make the whole thing cleaner? What's the approach? What do you think, Markus?
Thank you very much. So nice to meet you, everybody, and thanks for having me. First of all, that's many questions at one time. So, but let me start maybe with the last aspect, because we have done some different studies about the labor market impacts of the green transition. One you mentioned about the vocational training, but also one on the energy intensity at the regional level. And what we could see there at the study about the energy intensity of regions and their employment structure there is that in Germany, at least in Germany, the green transition has to take place in every region. And so every region is more or less involved in this transition process. And therefore, I think it's more recommendable to do also place-based policies just to promote the green transition within every region. And the transition processes may look very differently. It differs by the structure, the industry structure of the county. Some in Germany, for example, are very strong in terms of the automotive sector, suppliers there. and others are strong in the agricultural sectors. And so it's not one size fits all solution there, but I think it's definitely a time for place-based solutions, because I think and our studies show that you can solve something with mobility, but in times of this very large transition process, as every region has to do its homework by itself, every region should also be supported by structural funding.
Thank you. And Zeev, I think I want to link into that because in Germany in particular, the regions that we can, and you worked on Germany, the German survey, the regions that can be anticipated to be perhaps hardest hit in some ways by climate policies are now very rich. The automobile industry rich regions, for example. So do we need to somehow counterintuitively send some public support to regions that are now relatively wealthy, but might be very hard hit by strong climate policies? What do you think?
Yeah, thanks. So to be honest, like in our report, we didn't deal with that question in particular because we thought that our results are more related to measures in the individual levels. So, for example, when you discussed mobility, so we thought, of course, there is a trade-off that because of agglomeration effects. So if too many people will move from one region to another, that could even make the situation for those who stayed even worse. So, so I think for some very particular regions, maybe place-based measures make more sense. But in general, if you think how to improve the employability of individuals, like for some extent, helping individuals to move from, for example, from the East to West Germany is more reasonable. Maybe Robert, who's here, that also worked on the survey, have something to add.
Can you unmute Robert? You want to talk?
Yeah. Do you hear me? Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nicola, and also to everybody who's here. Just to add that we discussed it a little bit in the report, that actually there's also some signs that the green transition might benefit some of the regions that have actually suffered a lot in the last 30 years. So there's a lot of comparative advantage in the East, for example, for green energy production, and also in the North in some of the regions. And so that we already see some location of battery production of the Tesla company and some others input suppliers in these regions. So maybe you actually will get also some push for reducing regional inequality because of the green transition. This obviously is not in our CGE model which we use, but so there's some positive effects. And I also wanted to make the second point that in Germany we also have a strong social partnership in training and retraining, vocational training. So maybe always calling for the state is maybe also not their only solution. I think these companies like Mercedes or Porsche, they have a lot of resources and experiences of training people. So maybe they should also have some incentive maybe to develop other business models and try to retrain their workforce. But yeah, it's a complicated topic. Thank you.
Yeah, and that picks up a point made in the chat by Jan Hardy Krüger, who asked, should the greenhouse gas intensive industry be obliged to bear the cost of training? And should they, he's even going as far as to suggest there could be unemployment benefit insurance contributions that are somehow dependent on greenhouse gas emissions. And you, Anna, thought that was a good idea, and you've been raising your hand for quite some time. So please, what did you want to tell us?
Yeah, I would say the question is not if a region that is rich has to be supported in the phase of transition. The question is who pays that? Because in fact, regions that are supported, or even if the region itself does investments, we are all the time talking about taxes. So even if it's not the money of the region or it's the money of the state, both are taxes, the regional money and the state money. So the question is much more who pays the transition. And that's why I think it's interesting to think about the ones that are kind of polluting more than others. Also the ones that have huge revenues and also millionaires. So we have to think about the structure of our tax income in order to finance the transition, because I think we have a common sense that it's going to cost money, and someone has to pay that. Thank you.
Javier, you want to jump in? I have a question to Mr. Caprirolo, but since you're raising your hand, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicola. Just to chip in on this particular issue, I thought the question was very insightful, and I'm grateful for the person that made it. I think that there is already a mechanism that tries to address this issue, which is the European carbon trading system. So the idea will be, you know, the firms that pollute the most are the ones that pay the most, and, you know, provided that those funds are allocated to the right purposes in the transition, then, you know, that mechanism should suffice, I think. But it's a question mark on green finance that will require further investigation. Thank you.
That's an excellent point, Javier. Thank you very, very much. And you were nodding, Mr. Capriolo. But actually, what I wanted to come back to in the case of Slovenia is this issue of mobility. Slovenia is a relatively small country, but by German standards, we would say Austria is in some ways small. But still, Anna pointed out that it can be very complicated. Mobility. So how do you see that? How important is it to provide somehow the right infrastructure, the right support for people to move? Is it easier to move within Slovenia? You pointed to Silesia and another region that might be particularly hard hit. What's the role of geographical mobility to cushion the effects of the green transition?
Thank you very much. I wanted also to highlight the issue of labor shortages. I don't know whether in the studies that have been taking place, this has been internalized fully, because I think this is different to look at the evidence 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and today. Mobility is really not a simple issue, because people are, particularly in Slovenia, accustomed to live in their regions. And in this context, particularly since we have identified two regions that are particularly vulnerable because of producing of coal, actually we're devising actually a more comprehensive strategies to try to tackle the problems of those regions. Not that includes labor support, and also involve all social partners in trying to go beyond labor and also green opportunities. So this problem is tackled in this particular way, but providing housing affordability is not simple. But I think resources from this emission trading mechanism that actually are addressed to the one that's polluted can also help a little bit to enhance transfer communication by enhanced mobility, and also provide certain facilities. But still, housing is relatively a substantial problem. So, and I think besides, let's say, high intensive industries that can be tackled directly by, let's say, addressing these issues, I think we have other industries that require really more, let's say, a further analysis, because probably they are linked or in broader areas where markets are still tight and actually possibilities can be different. Also, it's my understanding that the skills in let's say brown jobs are not very different from the green jobs, but particularly different to the white jobs. So I think we should look at a little bit more on the overall labor market environment in which we are doing the transition. Thank you.
Alex, we've talked now a lot about, or basically your analysis talks about job loss and what happens then, right? But sometimes with the digitalization, we often say, well, it's not so much about job loss, it's a lot more about changing job content. So in general, do we need to think more about also how the training works in one firm? Is it really the case that everybody will have to move from West Germany to East Germany? What's, if we move away a little bit from your concrete analysis, which is obviously very helpful, how should we think about the labor market transition more generally?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Actually helps to put the work we're doing a little bit in context, because indeed, so we focus on job displacement because I think it's important to, it reflects the main concerns that people have about the green transition, even though it's only a very small part of the total adjustment that is needed within the labor market. So not all adjustment takes the form of job destruction and job creation, but there's also lots of change going on within firms. And ideally, we would like to look at that, but that we cannot really do because that would require us to have, basically to look at dirty firms or polluting firms relative to other firms and see how they change their technologies and they upgrade. And indeed, I mean, maybe the best way and the least costly way for both workers and firms would be to actually facilitate this upgrading, this transition in technology within firms. And I guess so with support in terms of skills on the worker side and maybe other type of support for firms to make the technological transition that's needed. I think you can maybe prevent a lot of the costs that we have been talking about. So I think that is super important, but it's not something that we can look at in period.
Thank you, Alex. And now everybody is warming up. So I have a hand from Javier, one from Marcus, and then there's Mr. or Ms. Mikro from the audience. Javier, please jump in.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with Alexander. And there was somebody else that jumped in with a comment on the role of the private sector. I think that I wanted to highlight the fact that there is also a role for the private sector to play in terms of bridging the gap in terms of skills. Now, there's one thing that we found in the report, and it's not only us. I think the literature is full of those examples of the role that foundational skills play. It might not be an issue so much in Germany, but maybe it might be a regional issue where some of the regions are less prone to have this sort of the stronger numeracy and literacy and problem-solving competences that would allow those workers to not only to transition but to relearn in the longer term. So one thing we want is for those for the interventions that the government can put in place to be the most efficient ones, because there's a cost involved, right? So one way in which we can reduce the cost in the long run is to provide the foundational skills even in those areas where there's in those lagging regions, so the workers can transition better in the future. And the last point I wanted to highlight is the role of other transitions. So there was a comment, I think, by Ms. Daimler, who was talking about the role of an apartment and then the prices and whatnot. And I think I kept thinking about aging as an issue. And you mentioned, Nicola, the digital economy. So all of these sort of mega trends and transitions happening at the same time highlight the need to use, yes, well, we already got the active labor market policies, and something that we haven't talked about, which is early retirement. You know, for those workers that can't transition, whether we can actually offer early retirement for those workers. But how do we take advantage of that sort of silver economy in a period of multiple transitions at the same time? That is a conundrum, I think, for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. And Marcus, you put up your hand too. But in addition to what you wanted to say, I did want to bring us back, after that perhaps, to Entgeltsicherung, so the wage insurance in Germany. And maybe you can give us some insights into why the take-up wasn't so good, as Alex suggested, and whether it's still an interesting instrument in that context.
Okay, I can combine that. So I just want to strengthen this last discussions, because also in Germany we see that the main part of the green transition is taking place within existing occupations, within existing jobs, and also within surviving establishments and companies. So yeah, so the presentation was really insightful and great, but in the first place it creates this picture that there are mass layoffs going on all the time in connected with the green transition. But I think it's just one. I think it's like to use the method to make it visible in this context. But I think it's in the main part of the transition takes place in existing companies, and we did another study about the ETS, or it's a work in progress. But what we see here is these firms that take part in the European emission trading system, that they even have a stronger employment growth during this last periods of emission trade. So they even are very strong companies that we see that are within this emission trading system, and only a few, and probably because of other reasons, die. I think so. The main part of these establishments grow even faster than comparable other ones, which is interesting to see, but another discussion. And what is also interesting is that we see that if you look at this green skills occupations, so occupations that have already some green skills, and compare them with occupations that have brown skills, so that are related to climate harmful tasks, we can see, for example, in the vocational training system that from 2013 to 2020, we have a growth in the occupations of green skills of about 14%. So 14% new contracts of vocational trainings in this field, whereas the occupations with brown skills suffer, they had a drop of about minus 15% in the same period of time. So there is something going on that we can observe already in the labor market in this early stage, or in this younger workers group. And we see something similar as we look also about the workers in the main labor market. So there's also this kind of greening of jobs going on at the moment. And so this leads me to the now preliminary summary or conclusion that we have the main challenge is where do we get the skilled labor to get the green transition done, and how to have a successful green transition. And so this is more, in my perspective, or at least in Germany, more a question of skilled labor or shortage, that in the other way, that it's not that big issue of job losses. And this now leads me to your last question, Nicola, because we did a research study about the coal phase out in Germany, which was published this year also. And what we found there is that also job loss was not the problem from this coal phase out in Germany. It's more like the presentation also showed today, it's a problem of wage loss. So in average, there was a wage loss of about 27% of wages from these workers that were in the lignite sector and now were successfully changing to other sectors. And so this is, I think, is calling for some other policies like wage insurance schemes, like the presenters were also discussing. And we compared this, we did a kind of scenario to this wage, because in Germany there was no wage insurance system in this case, but we were doing a scenario about that, and we were comparing it with this early retirement scheme that was supported in the coal phase out, and we found that it would have been much more efficient to have a wage insurance scheme instead of doing the early retirement system, because I think in times of skilled labor shortage, it's a bad idea to foster early retirement. There might be some cases where it's reasonable, but in this case, I think it was not the best idea. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, thank you.
No, actually, I do have, and I will ask others about it. I have two people at least with a hand raised who've been very patient. But I have a question from the audience, which is directly related, which is about place-based policies for example, lignite regions, which are, it's a very concentrated, this industry. And is that, then we talked about wage insurance, that's one way to approach this possible wage loss. Is there hope that investment in innovation in those regions and other industries like batteries, whatever, microchips, can that do the trick? What do you think?
Yes, I think it can. And I think it's necessary, as I mentioned already. So because I think this lignite areas in Germany, they have a high potential for other industries. And I think if you see this, currently we have about 8,000 workers in this lignite sector only. So given about 35 million employees in Germany, this is a very tiny group of workers. But it's very important to get a successful transition in these areas, because it's not only this 8,000 workers, and every worker is important, of course, but it's also the indirect effects and also this regional stability. This have to be taken into account. And so I think it's worthwhile to have this millions and millions of financial support that was funded now in these regions, because it's more than just this transition of these firms and these workers. It's more about to get a vivid region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I'll try to unmute Ms. or Mr. Mikov with a point about, and if you could turn on your camera, that would be great. We could see you. You had a point about carbon footprint.
Did you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Slaven Mičković. I'm coming from Employment Service of Slovenia. For some reason, my camera is not working, so I really do apologize not seeing me. But I will try to give a short comment on the use of carbon footprint. Actually, I disagree with approach simply to punish somebody who produce more, pay more. Simply to punish the company because it belongs to the brown party of the economy could be dangerous. Let's say some steel company may introduce relatively much more effort in order to let's say, follow the net zero path. What I want to say is that I believe that we have to introduce additional metrics, some forward-looking, if you want, metrics or relative metrics, which can measure how companies are prepared for this road to the net zero. Simply, of course, carbon footprint is a very important measure, but carbon footprint itself does not tell us nothing about how much the company is prepared for that, and that's the reason I believe that we have to introduce additional measures before we introduce some policy measures in order to mitigate the effects of this transition to net zero. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And maybe, Anna, you've been patient with me, but also you had a view about punishing or asking carbon-intensive industries, to contribute a bit more to retraining. So what do you think about Mr. Mitkovich's comments, Lavin's comments? Do you have a reaction? And then, of course, you can say what you did want to say when you raised your hand.
Yeah, I understand that point, but still we have to think of the structure of tax income that leads to financing transition. That's it. Where if there is an employer that has necessary carbon pollution and it is doing a lot to transfer the own company, that's a matter of how the rules are made. But I think there can be solutions. What I wanted to underline is what Markus Janse said. It's a matter of income guarantee, I think, and also a matter of job guarantee. What we experience is works quite fine is the transition within a company. So qualifying on the job for a slightly different ways of working in the future. There is what we say in German, Luft nach oben. So there can be done more, definitely. I think not that there is public money necessary to support here. Then we have the group of workers that want to change. They want to exit their sector. We had, for example, during Corona, airline employees that wanted to leave the sector. And the problem was that no one could really tell them what is their income while they retrain, so while they learn a different job. So it's hard to leave your job that is at the moment CO2 intense in order to go somewhere else when the administrative, the paperwork takes a very long time to the point where okay, when I go to, for example, healthcare, which is needed highly within all the European countries, and it takes a very long time to the point where okay, if I study now medicine or if I go to care, I will have during that education period XY euros, and I will earn this and that when I'm in that sector. So that's a problem. Workers need to know how much will they have within that education period or re-education period, and they need to know how much will they have when they are done with it. So when they're in the new sector, we need to answer that. So that's the income guarantee. We had a lot of pilots that are in Austria, at least, they have a good income. The alternative for them, an attractive alternative, is in fact not really there. An alternative income would mean that they have to switch into a management level where they don't have any education for. So those are really practical problems that we already have. And I think we can solve that quickly, actually, but there needs to be the willingness to solve those problems in order to make it attractive without being dismissed for a worker to change to a sector that is more green or more needed at the moment from a public point of view also. So if as a pilot, I will earn, I don't know, 1/4 if I go to the health sector. Why should I do that? That's irrational. People are not stupid. they are kind of rational person in their income, in their mobility, and so on. So we have to solve these practical obstacles that are there at the moment already. We are not talking about the future. We are in the present. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And we are already a bit past our time, but Javi, you raised your hand and wanted to jump in. But I think you can even conclude after that, after you said what you wanted to say a little bit for us, because the points that were raised now a little bit by Anna and others are a bit also about, we haven't talked about that a lot, but we talked about what workers need, right? The question about in terms of some job guarantee, some wage guarantee, you know, how important is it also to have the support for the green transition, which involves a lot of change, right? From people, something you dealt with in your book. That would be nice to hear from you, but also, of course, the point you wanted to make.
Thank you, Nicola. I apologize in advance because I don't have answers, direct answers. I've got some ideas, but they're only ideas. I wouldn't be as arrogant as to give you the answers. But I wanted to touch base on what Mr. Shimakov, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, mentioned. Just very briefly, it's at the end of the day, in my opinion, it boils down to behavioral change. And behaviors change with market signals, which in this case are prices, factor prices, which were other things that we were talking about with Ms. Daimler, as well as goods and services prices. The issue is that in environmental, in polluting industries, we've got the externalities phenomenon, and so that means that the prices of a given good, let's say steel, do not take into account the real cost of production. So just to respond to Mr. Simikov, what we want is actually a market that will reflect the cost of production for steel or any other industry, so that consumers can actually decide whether to buy something made of steel or even other materials. And that is the source of innovation. Something becomes more expensive, we find alternatives. Maybe there's something out there that is stronger and cheaper than steel, but we haven't found it. So it's a matter of letting the market. And let me conclude there. I think I think it's a very valid point by Ms. Daimler to say workers need guarantees, and of course that is the proposition that a welfare state will come to conclusion. In my view, it is about markets and is about prices, and you can't actually put a guarantee on what the prices will be for the work that a worker performs, because some of those occupations are actually unknown. So that is the problem, that we're dealing with the unknown, and in many of the work that we are doing, everyone in this room, we're trying to actually measure the demand for those greener occupations in the future, which is not an easy task, because many of those actually are unknown and are untapped yet. So we go to tools like web scraping, trying to find words that might not be actually invented yet. So with that, I thank you for your generosity in terms of your time to me. Thank you.
I think now you are muted, Nicola. Sorry.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Javier. And what I said is that it was useful, at least for us, to have him get up as early in the morning. And it was, I think it was a great presentation. Thank you, Alex, Cesar, and Zeev. And also a great discussion. It was good that we brought together Ljubljana, Vienna, Paris, Nuremberg, and Washington. Also, thanks to Mr. Miskovic. I'm sorry, but I don't pronounce the name right. It's not written entirely. And all the people who contributed in the chat. We will send around of course, the the videotaping, but also the links that have been shared in the chat, so you can continue to think about this important issue. And see you soon. I hope we'll have another event on the green transition at end November. So we're looking forward to welcoming you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.